Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for me to answer your questions about the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. So let's get to it. Mary from Seattle says, "Hi, Kirk. Could you talk about projective identification and projection in the context of the Depp Heard trial and their relationship?" Yeah, absolutely. So projection is the first thing I'll talk about. It's often misused in the public and among clinicians, usually as a synonym for distortion, but it's not that. The definition of a projection is, in terms of psychological terms, in terms of a psychoanalytic defense, is that we project our unwanted aspect of self onto other people. For example, when children are abused as children, they feel weak naturally, and they internalize that, and over time they really start to become convinced that they're weak and other people are strong, and they don't like that about themselves. They really hate the fact that they're weak, even though it's tragic that they're hating themselves. They're not weak, they're just being abused, but that's what they believe. And so as a result, some of these individuals, not all, a minority in fact, will hate the fact that they're weak and will project it onto other people and see other people as being weak. And they might even retain this into adulthood when in fact they themselves believe that they are weak. Or, for example, a closeted gay Republican politician who hates the fact that he's gay because of propaganda that he's absorbed in his community, and thus will deny the fact that he is gay, but see gay people everywhere and see them as a threat and try to attack them. Another example is a husband has thoughts about cheating on his partner. He doesn't like that about himself. He has distress about that, or at least he's on the fence, and so he denies that aspect of himself and projects it onto other people and accuses his partner of cheating or wanting to cheat. So these are classic examples of projection. And when we apply the defense of projection to the trial or to their relationship, it depends on how you see the relationship, how you conceptualize it. If we go with the verdict, then we might say that Amber Heard sees Johnny Depp as being abusive when in fact she knows that she's abusive, but she's in denial of that because she hates that about herself. If you are pro Amber Heard, then you would see it the opposite way, right? Another example, if you're in the pro Johnny Depp side of things, is that Amber Heard accuses Johnny Depp of constantly publishing public lies about their relationship when in fact Amber Heard is the one that is doing that. She doesn't like that about herself, or she's busted up about it. She's ambivalent about that aspect of herself. She goes into denial of the aspects that make her look bad and feel bad about herself, and she projects it onto Johnny Depp and says, "How come you're going to the tabloids and TMZ?" when in fact she knows that she's the one that does that. And if you're in the pro Amber Heard side, then you would see it the opposite direction. Okay, so that brings us to projective identification. And I'm going to describe to you my conceptualization, and the concept has been in the literature for over 100 years, starting with Melanie Klein and others in the early psychoanalytic community in the early 20th century. So there's been a lot of different definitions. My conceptualization is very similar to the original, but it is different. And the way I use it is very similar to the way Otto Kernberg uses it. I find his literature on projective identification to be very familiar to me. So projective identification is an extension of projection. It's projection with something else. And in essence, we again project by projecting onto others unwanted aspects of ourselves that we don't like about ourselves. This is mostly subconscious, unconscious. But we also socialize the target to behave in accordance with the projection. The following example is going to be in accordance with the verdict, which I know most of you actually agree with. So I know some of you don't, and so I hope you can tolerate that. Of course, I don't know if the trial was just or correct or right-headed. I'm just going to speculate about projective identification and its usages within their relationship based on the consensus opinion, not only with the jury, but also with the public and also with all the attorneys that I've spoken with. But we don't know. It's possible that the verdict was wrong. But anyway, so number one is that the self internalizes a dyad. This is very important in the analysis of projective identification. It's very important to start from the beginning and start with the fundamentals. Otherwise, everything gets thrown off if you don't start with this step, which is that you have to conceptualize internalized. And sometimes we have to make some guesses because our internalizations can happen pre 5 years old. So sometimes we don't really know, and we have to infer based on our current behavior and projective identification processes that a certain dyad must have been internalized. So when I mean dyad, that means two people. And so when we're young and we're having an interaction or we're observing an interaction between two people, we tend to absorb that. In the same way that we absorb language and culture and mannerisms, we internalize relationships and emotions as templates for how to view the world and how to view ourselves. It's complicated, but that's it in a nutshell. And so, for example, we will internalize our relationship with our parents. So if our parent is soothing us and we are in need of being soothed, we're distressed and our mother comes to us and soothes us, we internalize that dyad. And it's important to have it as a dyad, because if we don't conceptualize it that way because some people say, well, I internalized my mom. And that's not wrong to say that, but eventually we need to recognize that we've internalized both sides. We internalize the other, but we also internalize a vision of the self, an interpretation, a perception of the self. We are frequently observing ourselves as we're in interactions with other people. And so we internalize both of those aspects, the self and the other. And so later on, we will either identify with one side or other. It makes sense when I get down there. But anyway, so over time, as long as the interaction is intense and chronic and or patterned in a certain way, we will internalize that and it will become a part of ourself. A one-time interaction that is very intense can become a very important part of our self. Whereas if we have one or two interactions of a particular style, but it's not very intense and it isn't very frequent, then that won't really become a significant part of the self. But anyway, so with Amber Heard, we know that her father was violent and abusive. We don't know much beyond that, or at least I don't. And so I can only take guesses as to what was happening. But if we just hypothesize here, either Amber Heard was abused herself and she internalized the abused, hurt, weak self and the rageful, abusing, maybe pursuing father, and so that became a dyad, or she observed in her parents an abusive father and a distancing, weak mother, a hurt mother, and a victim mother. And for Johnny Depp, we know that he was abused by his mom. So in all likelihood, given this model of understanding what's personality, is that he internalized that dyad of mom berating him and abusing him, and himself feeling sad and berated and abused. So number one is we internalize that dyad. Number two is the interject, the internalization or the interject, the dyad, creates psychic problems later on in life by affecting our behavior and our self-dialogue. So for Amber Heard, if we go with the trial and the consensus, is that Amber Heard seemingly internalized the dyad of an abusive father and an abused self or an abused mother or both. And so as she is living her life, that is a part of her, that dyad is a part of her. Both aspects are a part of the self and can motivate behavior and perceptions and beliefs and thinking and all that kind of stuff. And so she starts to actually become pursuing and abusive and demanding of other people, maybe even in her teenage years. Again, it's complete speculation. And there's a part of her that is recognizing, oh, you're acting just like your dad. And the self has a tremendous amount of shame about that because they know how bad it feels to be abused in that way. And so to realize, wait, I am now the abuser is a terrible realization that the ego cannot tolerate upon first glance. And so it needs some way of dealing with that, which I'll get to later. The other aspect that will emerge is that there's a lot of self-talk. Because of this dyad is on the inside of us, the internalized abuser will say a lot of bad things to the abused internalization of the self or the mom. And so there'll be these voices that will be directed inward of, you're a piece of crap, you're terrible, you deserve this, you don't deserve anything good, you deserve everything bad, that kind of thing. And so that dialogue is going on, that self-talk is going on, and that's very distressing, right? With Johnny Depp, very similar hypothesis that he has internalized his mother. He has a lot of that dismissiveness and anger and ways of putting other people down and having nicknames, which we saw him do. He had a lot of ways of having nicknames for people. I don't know if it was abusive, but we did learn from his testimony that his mom would call him, certain names and the siblings' names. But anyway, so he starts to realize in his teenage years or early adulthood that he is kind of like his mother. He has aspects of himself kind of like his mother, maybe even as early as his early teen years. And he has tremendous shame. Also, he has this negative self-talk that's been internalized from his mom, and the dyad is inside of him, and his internalized mom is berating himself, saying that he's worthless and whatnot. And so he starts to use substances to cope with that. Amber Heard seemingly started to develop a pursuing, demanding, desperate way of trying to cope with what was happening in her, trying to get attachment security through those behaviors. Who knows if any of that is right, but if we're just hypothesizing. So number one, you have internalizing a dyad. Number two, you have the interject starts to create psychic problems. I'm actually skipping a lot of steps just to make it more easy. But number three is the ego. And again, this is my model. You're not going to hear this exact way of describing it from other people. But number three is the ego desperately seeks resolution. So we want to recreate the dyad. This is the beginning of projective identification. So defenses are in response to something that's going on inside of us that is distressful. So like think of denial, for example. If someone is drinking all the time and a part of them knows that they have a problem and they have a lot of distress around that, they will go into denial about the fact that they're drinking all the time. And if you talk to them, they're like, I don't have a problem. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't drink last night. And you're like, yeah, you did. So it's a defense against the ego onslaught of realizing the reality. And we do this all the time in various different ways. All of us do. And the greater the problem, the greater the need, and the more intensity and the more pathological the defense becomes. So when we have this internalized dyad and we're negative self-talking and we're also realizing we're like the monster that we grew up with, that creates a tremendous amount of psychic stress. And so we need some way of defending ourselves against that, defending the ego from realizing what's happening. And a very effective way is projective identification. And so what we will do is we will recreate the dyad in the external. And what it does is it takes it out of the internal world and makes it external. It's not great that we have a relationship that emulates our childhood relationship, but it's better than having it be on the inside of us, which creates 10 times as much distress for us. When we're just stuck with our own dyads and our own self-talk and our own shame, it's very distressful. So it's less distressful. It's still very distressful, but less distressful. It's the lesser of two evils if we recreate that relationship, and thus we can attack someone on the outside or blame someone on the outside instead of looking inward. And so why we do this is, one, to distract. We recreate it on the outside to make it external, and it distracts us from our negative self-talk and the realization that we are like the monster. Number two is we're trying to heal. We're trying to create a corrective experience. This is all subconscious, by the way. So we are trying to recreate the dyad, hoping that it will go better this time, and thus we can start to heal. This is where therapy comes in. Projective identification actually happens in therapy. Someone with borderline personality disorder will sit in my office and will try to get me to abandon them or betray them in some way, and I'll get to more of that later, and I will not abandon them and I will not betray them. I'll do everything I can to prevent myself from doing that. I'll do everything I can to counter that socialization, that influence, that manipulation. And by proving to the person with borderline, suffering from borderline, that I am here to stay and that I'm not going to harm them, I'm not going to exploit them, I'm not going to abuse them, then they internalize that and they can start to heal from that. They can start to trust themselves and trust other people. And that new relationship becomes internalized, and that becomes another dyad. And if we do that often enough, that dyad that is positive to the self becomes bolstered and more large and more effective in the personality, and the other opposing dyad becomes diminished and starts to go away. It never completely goes away, but it becomes less of a part of the personality. And thus, when they leave my office, they start to have positive self-talk, and they stop acting like the monster, and they start acting more like themselves or me in this new dyad interaction, if that makes sense. So when people are recreating a relationship with the monster by finding a monster or by being a monster and finding someone like themselves to be a monster with, they are subconsciously hoping that it will be corrective, that it will go different this time, but often it doesn't, right? And number three, we create this dyad over again to soothe because we are familiar with it. It's the devil we know. By recreating something that we grew up with, it feels familiar and it soothes us. Primarily because the monster often wasn't completely a monster. They were good to us. They provided security. They might have been very tender with us. And so that's what we associate with love and security, is also the monster, unfortunately. So we're recreating it as a way of trying to return home, if that makes any sense. So those are the three reasons: distract, heal, and soothe. Number 4 is that the ego searches for a good candidate to recreate the dyad with. For example, with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, if we follow the consensus regarding the trial, is Amber Heard becomes attracted to partners who are either easily victimized or will become abusives, because people will identify with either side. So for Amber Heard to externalize that dyad, remember, we need to have the recognition, we have that foundation that's a dyad. She can either project herself or her mom, depending on who was the victim, onto other people and identify with the monster, or she can project the monster and identify with the self or the mom. And people tend to, not always though, but they tend to have a pattern around that. And if we go with the consensus and the jury, then it looks like if this conceptualization is anywhere near the mark, then Amber Heard tends to identify herself with the monster and tends to project herself or her mom onto her partners, because she's had other relationships in which allegedly she was abusive and controlling. Johnny Depp, on the other hand, is also trying to recreate the dyad according to this model, and he seemingly has a pattern of identifying with himself and projecting his mom, trying to find people that look like his mom or feel like his mom or treat him the way his mom treated him. It's unclear about this, though, because I know nothing about his relationship with Vanessa Paradis. I know nothing about his relationship with Winona Ryder. We heard a little bit from Ellen Barkin during the trial about their relationship, but very little information. So, and the other thing about this is, even though the primary identification for Johnny Depp might have been himself, and he's projecting his internalized mom onto his partners, and he's trying to find someone that agrees with that, he might occasionally flip that. And there are mixed presentations where people consciously feel like themselves, but they are acting like the monster, if that makes sense. So it's not always just like the other person is always a complete representation of the other, and the self is always a complete representation of the self. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, it's getting into the weeds, but... And along those lines, going off this model, and this is all complete speculation, for Johnny Depp, when he was sober, he might have a really easy time identifying with the self side of the dyad, and when he got intoxicated, it would flip and he would become more like the monster, and he would project himself, the vulnerable, victimized self, onto other people. And this lends itself to some of the data. There are indications that, I think Johnny Depp even testified to this, that when he would be in a very distressed state, when he's writing on the lampshades in the window, it seems as though there's a possibility that a lot of those statements were berating him, that he's berating himself, and that was that negative self-talk emerging under great distress. And incidentally, this is why some people with a lot of that voice from the outside, when they're children, telling them that they're an idiot, or they're getting the message that they're an idiot, as an adult, when they make a mistake, you'll hear them, think of Napoleon Dynamite, will say things like idiot, because they're berating themselves, but that's not them. That's the internalized voice of the other. So that was number 4, is to find a good candidate to project one side of the dyad or both onto the other person. And by the way, people who have similar dyads that have been internalized as children tend to be attracted to each other, because it makes it so much easier to project one side onto the other person. So step 5 is to solidify the relationship, because once we fall into a very easy projective identification situation, we want it to stay. We need it to persist, because if that person moves away from us, if we break up with them, then we have to turn to ourselves. So we want to solidify the relationship, and one of the ways that the ego does this for us is that it promotes love for the other person and intense attraction, which we did hear from the two of them. Not that everyone who falls in love is due to this reason, but it is a conceptualization for why, for some people with unresolved dyads, with unresolved relational traumas, they tend to fall deeply in love with all the wrong people. And when they meet someone that's really healthy for them, they don't feel as much love. But according to at least my model of thinking, the intense feelings that they have towards the wrong person isn't actually love. It's the self tricking the self that it's love, because the self, the ego, wants to use projective identification with this person because the person is so perfect for that. It's a similar process that when people are suffering from addiction, that they will have a best friend that they use with. And then when they stop using the substance and they recover from their addiction, a couple years later, they look back at that person and are like, why was I friends with that person? And it's because they used with you and they justified your use. And so by being with them all the time, you could go mutually into denial about your use, and your subconscious mind tricked yourself into believing that the person was great and that you shared so much in common, when in reality it was just a very comfortable relationship that allowed a defense to manifest. Number 6 is the ego socializes the other person to agree with the projective identification. So this is really where the projective identification comes into the concept of projective identification. It's really what separates from projection. And for example, Amber Heard might subtly attack Johnny Depp to provoke him to leave her. We don't know if this is accurate, but we at least heard that a pattern of theirs was that they would start to escalate and then he would leave. So according to this model, it could be hypothesized that she would inadvertently, subconsciously pursue him or attack him or insult him or something, or I don't know, make him feel uncomfortable or distressed, and then it would provoke him to leave her. And then as that's happening, she feels abandoned, she feels betrayed, exactly the way she felt when she was growing up. And as he's moving away, that might emulate the way she was moving away as a child, or her mom was moving away. Again, total speculation, I have no idea. And then she could identify with her father, who would become demanding and abusive. For Johnny Depp, he might subtly abandon emotionally with Amber Heard, not physically, but might subtly abandon either through drug abuse or just a quiet demeanor or something. And that provokes from Amber Heard a sense of anxiety and abandonment, which provokes rage and demanding behavior, controlling behavior. Then he starts to feel abused, just like he did as a child, and the dyad has been successfully recreated. So again, both people, according to this model, are subtly socializing the other person to do the exact behavior that they don't want the other person to do, but unconsciously they're trying to recreate their original dyad of concern. Number 7 is the ego feels satisfied with this projective identification and settles in. And so this is the ongoing conflict in their relationship. And lastly, number 8 is the self internalizes this new experience with this new partner, and it bolsters that interject. So specifically for Amber Heard, if she were abused by her father, which I don't know, and she internalizes this dyad, which I don't know, and then she recreates it with Johnny Depp, which I don't know, and he starts to move away from her, and she is demanding and controlling of him, while on the conscious mind, in her heart, she feels as though he is abusing her. And this experience gets internalized, because we don't just internalize our early relationship, we internalize relationships throughout our life. We're more of a sponge when we're very young, but we continue to absorb relationships later on in life. And so the initial interject of being abused and of pain is bolstered. It becomes bigger and bigger and more prominent in the personality. And for Johnny Depp, a very similar thing, according to this model, might have happened, where he recreates a relationship in which someone is abusing him in a very unreasonable way by subtly manipulating the other person. Again, it's unconscious to do, and finding someone who is prone to do that kind of behavior, and thus he internalizes that, and his interject gets larger in his personality, and thus afterwards he hates himself even more and is more suspicious of other people. So I don't know if that made any sense, but that's my explanation of that. And it's kind of advanced stuff. This sort of lecture is what I will teach in graduate school, and it goes over most students' heads, to be honest. I will test them by having them analyze things in their own life around this, and I would say half the students get a little bit of it, and about a third or a quarter of the students really nail it. I'm always really impressed. When I meet students, I have no idea which are the geniuses and which are not. I mean, the non-geniuses are still smart, but there's some students that I have that are just like, I only have to explain what I just said, and they they're laser focused. And then I read their papers and they're just like, boom, they got the whole thing. I mean, because most people have never even heard of this concept before, and to hear it in a lecture and be able to apply it in a very intelligent way and systematically going through it in a detailed way, it's very impressive. It's much more rapid learning than I ever did with this concept. But anyway, so again, I want to remind everyone, particularly you pro Amber Heard people out there, because I know you're out there, that I'm not saying that this model coincides with any of the data. I don't know, but I just thought to demonstrate this concept, and the person did ask me to apply it hypothetically to the two of them, that I would just go with the consensus. But you could easily flip it around. If you believe that Johnny Depp was the main abuser, if not the sole abuser, then it's not hard to tweak little bits of what I just said to make it all fit as well. Now, this is not hard science. There's no way to empirically study this model, but it is very helpful in understanding people. Psychodynamic theory and all that is within it, including projective identification and all the other defenses and repetition compulsion, corrective experiences, is the only theory within psychology and psychotherapy that explains all the weird behavior that we do. There are theories that explain a lot of our behavior, behaviorism, cognitivism, other kinds of feminism, social construction, other kinds of theories really explain. But psychodynamic theory really is explanatory on a number of levels. If you've ever had relationship patterns where you're like, how come I keep seemingly getting in the same type of, how come I keep attracting the same sort of person? What's going on here? How come, are all men like this? Are all women like this? And this theory provides a way forward that I find to be extremely useful, because not only does it provide a lot of insight so that you can have control over things a little bit, so that when you fall in love with someone or you're attracted to someone, you can have some questions like, well, am I attracted to them for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? But more importantly, you know what to do in therapy to have corrective experiences such that you bolster a specific interject while diminishing another one, so that you don't need to think about things anymore. For you out there who have had that experience where you're seemingly attracted to the wrong person often, or you have a friend like that, it's much harder to strong arm yourself to avoid that sort of partner in the future. In fact, a lot of people just avoid dating altogether. But to tell yourself, okay, I'm not going to have feelings for that person, or I'm going to fall in love with a healthy person, even though they feel really boring to me. It's much harder to do that than to actually recover from those relational traumas, such that you just no longer are attracted to the wrong people and you find yourself being attracted to more healthy individuals. It's a very simple way of putting it, and it's hard. It takes a long time, but it's worth it. I've done that sort of work with a lot of people. I've done that work myself, and it has a lot of benefits to it. So there are a lot more questions, but the questions were from patrons of the podcast, so I thought the rest of the episode would just be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to listen to more of me answering questions, you want to go to patreon.com, become a patron, and you can hear this whole episode. Do it if you want to. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.